The lights went out at exactly 8:17 p.m. One moment, my living room was bathed in the glow of the evening news. The next, pitch black as the TV blinked off. Great, I muttered, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight. Power outages were common enough in the rural town of Haven, especially on muggy summer nights like this, when everyone's AC was cranked up high. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and did a quick sweep of the house. Yep, everything was dead. Lights, appliances, the ambient whir of electronics. Even the streetlights outside were dark, leaving the neighborhood shrouded in an eerie dusk. A chorus of neighbors shouting queries and complaints echoed down the street. My wife and I joined in, hollering from the front porch to see if anyone knew what had happened. The unanimous verdict was a substation malfunction. An inconvenience for sure, but nothing we small townfolk couldn't handle with a little patience. I headed back inside to light some candles. As I turned to shut the front door, a flicker in the sky gave me pause. I peered out. Was that a plane flying overhead? But no, it was too large and silent, more like a drifting cloud backlit by moonlight. Except the moon wasn't out tonight. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I craned my head to follow the object's path. It wasn't alone either. Two more huge, amorphous shapes drifted into view, emanating an otherworldly green glow. They were definitely not clouds. A primal unease stirred in my gut, whispering, "Get away," telling me I did not want to know the nature of those shapes in the sky. "Honey," my wife called from the kitchen, "could you bring in some more candles?" I lingered a moment longer, uneasy gaze fixed overhead. The shapes continued their silent traverse, showing no signs of stopping over our small town. Some kind of military aircraft, maybe? But what were they doing out here in the boonies? "Did you hear me?" My wife appeared behind me, her voice sharper. "What are you looking at?" I don't know," I stammered, pulling my eyes away. "Weird lights in the sky. Military planes, I guess." Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the horizon. "I don't see anything." A lame joke about my eyesight was on the tip of my tongue when a thunderous boom rent the quiet night open. We slapped our hands over our ears, ducking instinctively as the windows rattled. Car alarms whooped a chaotic chorus down the street. Dogs howled, and alarmed neighbors stumbled into their yards. "What the hell was that?" my wife shouted over the din. Through the open door, we gaped as an enormous green fireball roared overhead, arcing toward the woods at the edge of town. It disappeared behind the trees with an earth-shaking crash, leaving silence and swirling ashes in its wake. For the space of a few racing heartbeats, no one moved. Then our neighbors began shouting questions back and forth, asking if anyone had seen what had happened, if everyone was okay. I shook myself from my shocked stupor. "I'm calling 911, I announced, reaching again for my phone. But when I tried to turn it on, the screen stayed black. I smacked it against my hand a few times, to no avail. "Power's still out, my phone's dead. Can I borrow yours?" "It's dead too," my wife said. "What did we just see? A meteor, maybe? Some space junk?" I said. I peered uneasily up at the night sky, but it was now empty of any unexplained lights. Only a wispy trail of smoke snaked above the trees, marking the object's landing site. As I wondered aloud who might go to investigate, the streetlight suddenly flashed back on. A cheer went up from the growing crowd of residents now congregating on porches and sidewalks, glad to have light and power again after the disturbance. My phone vibrated in my hand as it rebooted. Before I could access anything, it began pinging and buzzing with emergency notifications from the county. I quickly scanned the flood of headlines demanding people stay inside and lock their doors and windows. Local emergency services were being overwhelmed by panicked calls, and law enforcement was struggling to maintain order in neighboring towns amid chaotic reports of strange lights in the sky and unidentified crashes. Officials were advising everyone to remain calm and stay put until the situation could be sorted out. Easier said than done, as panic was already rippling through our small community. More meteors and unidentified objects continued streaking overhead every couple of minutes, adding to the confusion and fear. Against official recommendations, some neighbors were hunkering down in their basements, while others were piling into cars and peeling out to flee town. I wanted desperately to believe there was some rational explanation, that this was all just a cosmic coincidence of space debris falling at once. But an increasingly insistent voice deep inside whispered that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. My worst suspicions were confirmed minutes later, when a bone-rattling roar echoed from the woods, like the shriek of a gigantic metal beast. The ground vibrated beneath our feet, as the trees themselves seemed to shudder and recoil from whatever was approaching. From the billowing smoke lumbered an enormous tripedal machine, easily 5 stories tall, its massive metal hull wreathed in a menacing aura. Searing red lights flashed from its joints as it strode into town, swiveling a lone eye to survey the panicked prey before it. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the merciless gaze of the alien invaders. I stood frozen, mesmerized by abject terror, as the machine raised one colossal limb and took aim down the street. It started as a hobby, rigging up old ham radio equipment in my attic to scan obscure frequencies on clear nights. Most often I'd only pick up static and garbled voices cutting in and out. But one cold February night, a new signal came through, crystal clear. A sequence of musical tones, almost like a synthesized choir chanting. It repeated every few minutes, strong and purposeful. I recorded hours of it, transfixed. This was no random signal. It carried something meaningful, a clear message of some kind. I digitized the audio and ran it through decoding software to analyze the patterns. After days of work, a set of geographic coordinates emerged. To my shock, they pinpointed a remote spot less than 20 miles from my house. The signal had to be coming from there. The next morning, I hiked out to the coordinates located deep in the woods. I nearly dismissed it as just a prank when the alleged source came into view. A small ramshackle cabin stood tucked away off the trail. Was someone just broadcasting weird signals from their backwoods home? Curiosity propelled me forward, but nearing the cabin, things seemed off. Strange dish antennas, rolls of wire and other electronics cluttered the perimeter instead of firewood or tools. The windows emitted a faint blue glow. Apprehension swelled within me, but I had to see who or what was in there. I crept onto the porch and peered inside. Complex machines and panels covered every surface, flashing and beeping as abstract images raced across monitors. And working intently at a console was something I could barely comprehend. A tall, spindly being with huge, opaque eyes and pale blue skin. It took me a moment to accept that it was real and not human. I must have made a gasp, because the creature's head jerked up to look right at me. I was too shocked to even panic as it moved swiftly to the door. It opened it halfway, studying me cautiously with those impenetrable black eyes. "You should not be here," it finally said in a strangely resonant voice. "But if you have decoded my broadcast, perhaps you can understand my situation. Please come in. Part of me wanted to bolt from this bizarre situation, but my curiosity won out. I slowly entered what I now realized was a spaceship in the guise of a cabin. The alien sat me down and offered fluid in a curious metal vessel. As I sipped the sweet libation, it began its tale. Its name was unpronounceable in my tongue, so I just called it Zarin. Many cycles ago, Zarin served as researcher on an exploratory vessel. Its crew had strict orders to covertly observe developing worlds without contact. But one day they encountered a grievous distress signal from Earth. Against protocols, they intercepted a primitive capsule hurtling through space. Inside were 2 distressed Earth creatures. While the creatures were safely returned, the unauthorized rescue led to disaster. Accused of dangerous cultural contamination, Zarin was exiled on this very planet. Its actions sought to aid. Its crew abandoned it here over a century ago by Earth time. Zarin had been surviving in hiding, ceaselessly monitoring human airwaves to understand its caretaker's mysterious culture. My mind reeled taking all this in. Of all the backyard hobbyists to pick up its covert signal, Zarin was intrigued that I alone seemed drawn to make contact. It confessed that it had slowly been going mad from isolation and longed to make amends by using its knowledge to aid humanity. But first, it required help adapting to society. I knew then why that strange broadcast had called me so powerfully. A higher purpose had drawn me straight to this extraordinary refugee. Doing so came with great risk. Even interacting this far could be seen as treason by its people. But how could I turn away? After swearing to secrecy, I helped Zarin slowly integrate into the world. It learned English, adopted a human disguise, and made breakthroughs in science using its advanced knowledge, while living anonymously among us. My relationship to this alien will forever remain hidden, but I know humanity has gained immeasurably from Zarin's presence, even if they remain oblivious. And this remarkable being can finally share its culture's wisdom after lifetimes of silence. The radio hobby that connected us across light years of separation was no accident. I was meant to help this alien in exile find a belonging in its newfound home. Within its tale, I see hope, that our differences need not divide us, that the greatest rewards come from opening our minds to possibility. Zarin gave me the universe by showing me how to more fully inhabit this single fleeting life, for however long our unlikely friendship can preserve. It started as a hobby, setting up a high-powered telescope in my backyard on clear nights and gazing deep into our galaxy. As an amateur astronomer, I loved picking out familiar constellations and nebulae, tracking the trajectories of planets and asteroids, and pondering the mysteries of black holes. On rare occasions, I'd even spot a comet streaking past or catch sight of the gold-hued rings of Saturn. My telescope opened up the secrets of the cosmos right from my suburban home. But everything changed that cloudless night in June when I first picked up the signal. I was scanning the telescope slowly along the dusty swath of the Milky Way, marveling as always at the millions of stars packed densely together like grains of glittering sand. I lingered on a binary star system, intriguingly called Zeta Reticuli, before panning upward. That's when a rapid flash of light from a dimmer part of the sky caught my eye. I quickly focused the telescope on that patch of the night. It took me a moment to spot the source, not a star, but some unidentified object beyond our solar system, sending out a deliberate sequence of pulses. My heart began pounding. I grabbed my notebook and pen and frantically scribbled down the sequence. 3 short pulses, 3 long pulses, 3 short, pause, repeat. It was clearly a patterned signal, which meant it must have some kind of meaning. My mind raced through the possibilities. A monitoring program from some secret government space agency, a research craft sent out by extraterrestrial beings, or even a message, a signal intentionally beamed across light years of space. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with deciphering that cryptic message from the void. Nights when the sky was overcast left me restless and irritable as I yearned to train my telescope on that now familiar region. On clear nights, I diligently recorded each repetition of the pulsing sequence, searching for possible variations. After completing pages of data, an eerie realization struck me. The sequence was expressing binary code. The short pulses represented ones, and the long pulses symbolized zeros. The message began to take legible shape, translating roughly to, "Hello, we come in peace, we seek contact." Contact. They, whatever they were out there, sought to make contact with our planet. A shudder passed through me, equal parts exhilaration and dread. What forces had I unwittingly contacted in the dark oceans of space? And did humanity truly stand ready for this moment? I continued watching the signal, deciphering new messages as they came. They spoke of a distant civilization from a planet in the Zeta Reticuli system, long ago ravaged by war and climate disaster. The messages alluded to their immense scientific knowledge and expressed hope we could work together to build an interstellar utopia. But underneath the lofty utopian dreams, an unsettling undercurrent emerged. They urged us to join the Federation and embrace universal law. Ominous references to colonization appeared, along with hints that resistant civilizations could be pacified. I became convinced there was a veiled threat beneath their promise of peace. This growing unease festered in my mind, magnified by lack of sleep and constant anxiety. I stopped leaving the house, rarely ate or bathed, entirely consumed by the messages streaming nightly from light years away. I was unable to share my discovery with anyone else. It sounded far too insane. Until one sweltering midnight, when the messages took an urgent new turn, no longer encoded, but spelled out in plain, ominous letters. "We come. Prepare and submit." Adrenaline spiked through my system. They were coming. For us. Soon. I shut down the telescope and gathered all my notebooks filled with inscrutable figures and frantic scribbled translations. In a manic whirlwind, I destroyed my hard drives, sabotaged my equipment, and burned all the papers out behind my shed. I hoped desperately it would be enough to sever the connection, shut out their intrusion into our small world, delay their sinister arrival for a few fleeting days. But I can feel their presence now, ominous and heavy, seeping into the very atmosphere of our vulnerable planet. Sometimes I still catch the coded signals winking slyly at me from familiar constellations, taunting me that I was too weak to shield us from what's to come. In my most hopeless moments, staring up at the indifferent sky, I wonder if humanity will look upon this year as our last before oblivion arrived, silently, from the stars. I don't know how long I was out before I came to, strapped naked on a cold metal table in a sterile white room. My foggy brain struggled to piece together some explanation from how I went from driving home from work to this. Blurry figures moved in my peripheral vision. I tried to lift my head, for a better look, but some invisible force held it locked in place. A tall, gangly creature entered my field of vision. He had a bulbous bald head with opaque black eyes and pale gray skin that seemed to glow under the harsh lights. Spindly fingers covered in some sort of black gloves or claws tapped a device it held in its equally spindly hands. I opened my mouth to speak, scream, anything, but quickly realized I was also paralyzed from the neck down. Helpless panic gripped every fiber of my being. The creature must have sensed my terror. In my mind, I heard a thin, reedy voice. "Do not be frightened. We intend you no harm. We only wish to improve your species, to prepare you for what is coming." Invisible claws clamped down on my head as an excruciating pain ricocheted through my skull. It felt like my brain was being shredded and reassembled as images and concepts flashed before my eyes. Advanced technology, complex mathematics, cosmic disasters, future events. More creatures entered the room and began manipulating my limbs, injecting substances, prodding and poking me. After what felt like an eternity of tests, my overwhelmed mind gratefully slid into unconsciousness. I awoke sometime later back in my car, parked in my driveway. My head throbbed as I tried to piece together if it had all been some bizarrely vivid nightmare. But the lingering pain in my temples and dried blood under my nose told me otherwise. Those creatures, whatever they were, had been inside my head, and they did something to me. In all the days that followed, the changes began. Headaches persisted no matter how many pain pills I took. But I also noticed food no longer satisfied my gnawing hunger. My vision sharpened until I could read license plates from a block away. The strange voices in my head grew louder. I started having vivid premonitions that would come true. A coworker's car crash, an election upset, even trivial things like TV scheduling changes or pop quiz questions. Somehow I could glimpse upcoming events, almost like watching a stream of the future. My body changed, too. I no longer seemed to need sleep, yet woke every morning feeling fully energized. Previously sluggish thinking accelerated to lightning speed. I solved complex equations instantly and remembered entire textbooks, word for word. But the toll was immense migraines that sometimes left me writhing, incapacitated on the floor for hours. At work, I predicted a system failure before it happened, saving us millions. My bosses said I was brilliant. Little did they know alien abductors did something to transform me into a superhuman freak. Part of me wanted to tell the world, to find meaning in my violation. But how could I without sounding insane? The voices in my head had grown to a constant, chaotic chorus only I could hear. They whispered horrors, crashes, explosions, suffering, and death on global scales. I caught glimpses of creatures and spacecraft hidden behind a thin veil that previously concealed them. The experiments performed on me clearly ruptured the flimsy illusion, separating our ordinary reality from levels beyond. I tried drowning the voices out with music, drugs, anything I could think of, but they only intensified. Soon they were screaming, pleading with me to act before the coming cataclysm. I wasn't sure if I was tapping into some real truth or simply going mad. Maybe I already was. The final straw came after a week of ceaseless migraines and zero sleep. In the mirror, my eyes appeared blackened from burst blood vessels. My gums bled spontaneously, and my fingers trembled uncontrollably. How long until whatever alien substance they pumped me with finally killed me? That night, as I rocked and muttered to myself, a booming voice cut through the others, commanding me, "Go to the cave. Our technology can save you and your planet, but time grows short." Somehow I knew exactly the cave it meant. one I had played in as a child on family camping trips. I tore out of my house and sped recklessly into the hills until I came to that familiar rocky outcropping. A perfect full moon illuminated the small black mouth of the cave's entrance. I stumbled inside, not even questioning my surreal actions, lured by a promise of relief from the unrelenting torment. Deeper, I crawled until the narrow walls opened into a large cavern with a glowing blue light at its center. Mesmerized, I stepped toward it. The angry chorus in my head became a single high-pitched drone the closer I came to that glow. I realized my mistake too late. I had walked right into their trap. The force that seized control of my body was even greater than during the first abduction. I was a puppet, compelled by some external power to march stiffly toward that pulsing light, compelled to become something far from human. Just as my hand reached for the hypnotic light, instinct took over. I wrenched back control of my body and let out a primal scream of rage at the creatures who thought they could dictate my fate. With the last of my energy, I ripped a sharp stone from the cavern wall and plunged it into my chest, collapsing as hot blood gushed. I lay gasping on the cold cave floor, life ebbing away, but at least I would die as myself and not their specimen. As my vision faded, I heard their frustrated screams fade to silence. I can only pray my small act of defiance delayed their apocalypse just a while longer, so someone else might find a way to avoid the grim future preordained for our race. A future I glimpsed in my final moments, our planet harvested, and humanity mutated into some cold new form. But perhaps we still have time to forge another path. Perhaps. At first, I brushed off the odd series of coincidences as just that, coincidence. But deep down, I sensed each one was an orchestrated breadcrumb, luring me toward something bigger. It all started with the lottery ticket. I never play the lottery, but on some whim, I bought a scratcher at the gas station one night. Amazingly, I won $500. Not a fortune, but probably the most I'd ever won gambling. I decided to splurge on a fancy steak dinner. When I arrived at the restaurant that night, they had no record of my reservation. Annoyed, I turned to leave just as another couple was exiting. They kindly offered me their table, saying that they had suddenly fallen ill. I thanked my lucky stars. Halfway through my meal, nature called. In the bathroom, the motion sensor sink turned on as I walked by. Oddly, the faucet sputtered and a tiny object shot out of the drain right at my feet. A gold ring with a cryptic symbol etched in black. Even odder, it somehow fit my ring finger perfectly. Just then, the bathroom doors swung open, and a gruff voice ordered me back to my table immediately. I pocketed the ring and complied. Later, when I asked my server about the ring symbol, his smile wavered momentarily before he leaned in and whispered, "You've been chosen. Follow the signs." Before I could ask what he meant, he hurried off. I chuckled, assuming he was messing with me. Over the next week, that ring symbol seemed to pop up everywhere, etched into a subway pillar, engraved on a mailbox, even tattooed on the wrist of a barista handing me my morning coffee. Each time I spotted it, a strange tingling would spread up my arm from the ring on my finger. That weekend, another string of improbabilities led me to book an impromptu trip to Nevada. On the flight there, my seatmate made small talk, asking where I was heading. When I told him the name of my hotel, he raised an eyebrow and said I should explore a certain unmarked dirt road near the property. "Just look for 3 cacti clustered together," he said. I did find that strange road out in the desert behind the hotel. After miles of empty wilderness, I came across what looked like an abandoned shed. Suddenly, my vision blurred, the same strange tingling shooting down my arm from the ring. Without thinking, I approached the shed, and the door swung open on its own. A narrow staircase spiraled down into inky darkness. Every nerve told me to flee, yet I found myself descending step by step into the void. The temperature dropped sharply. Strange mechanical hums and echoing voices drifted up. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a massive domed chamber. Catwalks crisscrossed the space high above my head. Figures in white lab coats scurried about, attending to large cylindrical chambers covered in warning symbols and containing something alive. Creatures I couldn't fully glimpse, but that seemed only half-formed, not of this earth. I should have turned and run. Instead, I crept forward along the perimeter of the vast chamber. That's when I saw it in the center, a mammoth disc-like craft resting silently on a raised platform. Access panels on its smooth metal hull were open, exposing a maze of alien circuitry and pulsating with light. Human scientists hovered around it, studying and making notes. One inserted a long robotic arm into the craft's inner workings. My blood turned to ice. This was no abandoned shed. It was a secret government site for reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology. All those seeming coincidences had drawn me here. But why? Just then, alarms screeched to life, pulsing red lights flooding the facility. A panicked voice over the intercom shouted, "Protocol Omega initiated." The scientists scattered as security teams stormed through the side doors, spotting me as the intruder. I turned and ran wildly back the way I came. I raced blindly through deserted hallways, footsteps echoing close behind. Up ahead loomed a massive vault door marked Hangar B. It creaked open just enough for me to slip through before slamming shut. The lock spun with a heavy, final clunk. I found myself on a vast tarmac filled with even more mammoth alien craft, all surrounded by heavily armed soldiers. One began rising with a metallic groan, rotors kicking up debris. Before I could react, some unseen force pulled me toward the craft. A beam of light enveloped me, lifting me up effortlessly into its belly. As the hatch sealed below, I knew I was trapped in the clutches of something far beyond my comprehension. The ring still tingled familiarly, almost mockingly, reminding me this had been the plan all along. I was the chosen one, but for what sinister purpose? The craft accelerated skyward, the G-forces pressing me to the cold metal floor. Slowly, the planet's curve became visible out the thick glass windows. I shut my eyes, sending a silent prayer for anyone left behind on that fragile blue marble, drifting farther and farther into the distance below me. Wherever I was going, I knew Earth and humanity were now lifetimes behind me. The Transnational Express had always been a dream of mine, a cross-country train journey that zigzagged through small towns and big cities, offering panoramic views of the landscapes most people only saw in travel brochures. When work dried up and my apartment lease ended, it seemed like the universe was giving me a sign. So, with a one-way ticket and a duffel bag, I boarded the train and settled into my seat. A couple of hours into the journey, I discovered an old, worn-out paperback wedged into the seat pocket in front of me. No title, no author, just a yellowed cover that looked as though it had survived a few decades. Curiosity piqued, I flipped it open and began to read. The story was engaging from the get-go, featuring a protagonist named Alex, who had an uncanny number of similarities to me. Same age, same hometown, even the same peculiar birthmark on the right wrist. The sense of déjà vu was amusing at first. But then, as I turned the pages, the amusement turned to disbelief. Every minor detail, every anecdote, mirrored my life. There were episodes I hadn't shared with anyone. Private moments, embarrassments, triumphs. It was as if someone had rifled through my memories and penned them down, rebranding them as fiction. I scanned the train car, suddenly paranoid. Faces stared blankly out windows or were buried in books and screens. No one paid me any attention. Yet I felt horribly exposed, as though I'd found a hidden camera in a dressing room. Forcing myself to breathe, I decided to keep reading. I needed to know how deep the rabbit hole went. The story meandered through familiar events, then veered into unfamiliar territory. Here, the narrative split from my reality. In this alternate life, Alex had never boarded the Transnational Express. Instead, he stayed in his hometown, shackled to a job he loathed, embroiled in a doomed relationship. Page by page, the story unfolded into a cautionary tale, a life filled with regret and missed opportunities. I read about Alex's downward spiral with growing unease. The climactic sense was jarring, a tragic end involving a car accident, alcohol, and shattered dreams. I closed the book, my hands trembling. Was this some kind of sick joke? A warning? Restless, I roamed the train, passing through cars filled with families, solo travelers, and empty seats. When I reached the observation car, I found it deserted, except for an elderly woman seated by the window. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing for a moment before widening in recognition. "You've read the book, haven't you?" she said, her voice tinged with an accent I couldn't place. "What is that thing?" I asked, holding up the yellowed paperback as though it were evidence in a trial. "It's a glimpse," she replied. "A glimpse of another path, another ending." "But why me? Who wrote this?" "Some questions don't have answers," she said, staring past me at the blur of landscapes rushing by. "Or perhaps they have too many to count." "Is it a warning?" I pressed, seeking some thread of sense in this woven chaos. "It's a gift," she said, meeting my gaze. "Whether you take it as a warning or an inspiration is entirely up to you." I left the observation car, my mind a labyrinth of questions without exits. Back in my seat, I shoved the book into my duffel bag, burying it beneath clothes and toiletries. Yet it felt like it weighed a ton, pulling me toward an understanding that remained tantalizingly out of reach. The train journey continued. Stops were made, passengers disembarked, new faces appeared. But the scenery outside felt like a backdrop to the storm of thoughts inside me. Could I take this fork in the road, so vividly outlined in the pages of a nameless book? On the final day of the journey, I awoke to find the seat pocket empty. The book I had returned had vanished. I rummaged through my bag, but it was gone, as if it had never existed. No one else on the train remembered seeing it, or had any knowledge of the elderly woman in the observation car. When the train pulled into the final station, I stepped onto the platform, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The air was different here, filled with a sense of potential, a vibrancy that felt miles away from the life I'd left behind. I hailed a cab and directed it to a local inn. As I checked in, the woman at the front desk handed me a form to fill out. "New in town?" she asked, her eyes friendly, her smile genuine. "Yes," I said, grasping the pen and hesitating for just a moment before writing down my name. Not Alex, the name I'd been given, but a new one, a name of my choosing. As I signed, I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was the same time the accident would have happened, according to the book's narrative. The coincidence, or was it fate, sent a shiver down my spine. I collected my room key and headed upstairs. But as I turned the corner, I froze. At the far end of the hall, a door creaked open, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw the elderly woman from the observation car step out, her eyes meeting mine in a knowing glance. And then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there, a cold draft whispering down the corridor, caressing the birthmark on my wrist. I gripped the key in my hand, its jagged edges digging into my palm, as if urging me to unlock not just a room, but a life yet unwritten. And as I inserted the key into the lock, I wondered, would this door lead me to the story the book foretold, or to one of my own making? The lock clicked open. I stepped inside, leaving the door ajar behind me. Cancun was a paradise of blue skies and even bluer waters. The ocean was its own world, alive and whispering secrets through the currents. I'd spent the entire year looking forward to this snorkeling trip. My dad used to tell stories about how our ancestors were seafarers, explorers who mapped uncharted waters. I always felt a connection to the ocean that I couldn't explain, like a song whose lyrics I had forgotten, but whose melody stayed with me. On the third day, armed with snorkeling gear and a waterproof camera, I took a boat trip to a secluded reef. The guide, Ricardo, assured me it was an extraordinary spot, a place where the sea unveiled its hidden beauty. As soon as I plunged into the water, I was in another realm. Schools of vividly colored fish danced around me. Corals stretched out like ancient cities, an underwater metropolis teeming with life. I lost track of time, mesmerized by the vibrant underworld. But as I swam farther from the other snorkelers, the scenery began to change. The water got darker, and the corals appeared older, their colors muted. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. An object half buried in the sand below, its outlines too straight and angular to be a natural formation. Curiosity pulling me deeper, I dove down for a closer look. What I found stopped me cold. A statue, humanoid but not human, its features a surreal blend of aquatic and terrestrial elements. It looked ancient, the material worn away by countless tides. It was the plaque at its base that took my breath away, literally and figuratively. My family's last name was etched onto it, Mendoza. I blinked, half expecting the letters to rearrange themselves, to make this bizarre occurrence some kind of misreading. But they remained, a cold testament set in stone. I took photos, my hands trembling. I had to show this to someone. I had to have proof that this wasn't some sort of underwater mirage. I quickly swam back to the boat, my heart pounding in a rhythm it had never known. When I showed Ricardo the pictures, he looked puzzled, and then concerned. This isn't something I've seen before, and I've been guiding tours for over a decade. You sure about the location? I nodded, pointing it out on the laminated ocean map he had on board. Ricardo scratched his head. That's not a typical spot for tourists. Too many local legends about sea spirits and forgotten gods. The fishermen avoid it. Ignoring my heightened sense of dread, I pressed him for more information. But he shook his head, reluctant to indulge in what he called superstitious nonsense. For the remainder of the trip, I couldn't get the statue and its plaque out of my mind. Who had put it there? How long had it been in the ocean? What did it mean? When I returned home, I showed the photos to my family. They were fascinated, but equally baffled. My dad, always the history buff, tried to dig into our family archives but came up empty. There were gaps in our lineage, periods where records were either incomplete or missing. Looks like our ancestors were good at keeping secrets, he mused. Weeks later, long after the trip was a collection of photos and memories, strange things began to happen. I found myself increasingly restless, a peculiar type of insomnia that left me tossing and turning, the sound of waves echoing in my ears even in the dead of night. Then I started to dream, visions of vast oceanscapes, of ancient rituals, of murmured incantations that seemed to flow from the statue's chiseled lips. Each morning, I would wake exhausted, like I'd been on an endless nocturnal journey. The final straw was the night I woke up to find my bed soaked, as though I'd been submerged in water. The room smelled of salt and seaweed, like a shoreline after high tide. And there on my nightstand sat a small shell, a type I had never seen before, its spirals forming a pattern eerily similar to the designs on the sunken statue's plaque. I booked a return trip to Cancun, this time alone. When I met Ricardo, I could see the unease in his eyes. "You sure you want to go back there?" "I have to," was all I could say. As the boat neared the spot, my heart tightened in my chest. Donning my snorkeling gear, I plunged into the ocean, propelled by a force I couldn't deny. I reached the statue, its presence as unsettling as before. But now it felt like an unfinished chapter, conversation interrupted but not concluded. I took a piece of paper, a waterproof one, and a pencil from my gear. On the paper, I wrote my full name, then pressed it against the plaque, securing it with a small net bag usually used to collect underwater samples. Then I waited. It didn't take too long. The water around me began to churn, the sand swirling like a miniature storm. I felt a pull, not of the current, but something deeper, as if the ocean itself had gripped my soul. My vision blurred, and when it cleared, I was back on the boat, Ricardo staring down at me, his face pale as seafoam. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As we sped back to shore, I looked at the photograph of the statue one last time, and then deleted it from my camera. Some mysteries, it seemed, demanded their own form of isolation, their secrets too heavy for the surface world. That night, in my hotel room, I found another shell on my pillow, identical to the first one, but this time it came with a note. "Welcome home." I haven't gone snorkeling since, not because I'm afraid, but because I'm not sure what I'd be returning to, a world of coral and fish, or a lineage that stretches into the dark corners of the sea. And sometimes, when the night is still and the moon casts its glow on the water's surface, I hear whispers, voices that beckon, that plead, that promise. They call to me from depths I can't fathom, asking me to reclaim a legacy that was submerged long before I was born. And I wonder, with equal parts dread and longing, what would happen if I answered. The gate was rusted, the fence overgrown, but the foreboding air around the old military base remained palpable. I had heard stories, of course, urban legends of secret experiments and concealed truths, but those tales didn't deter me. Armed with a camera and the boundless optimism of an explorer, I pushed through the rotting barriers. The base lay like a fossilized relic, caught between the past and an uncertain decay. Buildings stood emptied of life, yet filled with the ghosts of classified actions. Most doors were locked or jammed, but one yielded as if inviting me into its secrets. It was an underground bunker, a dark descent into subterranean chambers. I flicked on my flashlight, illuminating corridors lined with locked metal cabinets and old office furniture. Then something caught my eye. A file cabinet standing slightly ajar, its lock apparently defeated by time or previous intruders. Curiosity pulled me closer. The first few folders were mundane, predictable stuff, budget reports and duty rosters. But then I found it. A file marked with a symbol I had never seen, but instantly understood as being not of this world. It was as if the very sight of it instilled the symbol's meaning into my brain. Alliance. My hands shook as I leafed through the documents. What they revealed was a narrative so outrageous, yet so meticulously detailed, that disbelief turned into dread. This was no conspiracy theory. This was an actual alliance between high-ranking government officials and an alien civilization, identified only by the same strange symbol. The file outlined joint projects, exchanges of technology and information, plans for public disclosure, and contingencies for keeping it all under wraps. Dates spanned decades, and some even projected into the future. Upcoming rendezvous, expected technological handovers, even a long-term agenda for the slow integration of the two civilizations. What really seized my attention was the handwritten notes scribbled in the margins, desperate warnings from what seemed like a dissenting officer. "We don't know their true objectives," one note read. "We are fools playing with fire," declared another. As I flipped through the last pages, I realized the documents became increasingly recent. The most chilling entry was the last, a single sentence typed and underlined. Final phase initiation imminent. A shiver crawled up my spine. I looked around, suddenly conscious of the enclosing darkness, of how deep underground I was, of how alone I felt. The air thickened, and for the first time I considered that I might not be alone at all. Just then, a noise echoed through the bunker, a mechanical hum gradually intensifying. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into oppressive darkness. I fumbled to get it back on, heart racing, but it seemed drained of power. In that darkness, I felt a presence, not human, yet undeniably sentient, surrounding and analyzing me. Curiosity is both your strength and your downfall, a voice resonated in my mind. I recognized the form of telepathic communication, a cold stream of thoughts invading my consciousness. You have discovered a truth not meant for your kind. Not yet. The weight of those words left me paralyzed. I felt my thoughts being sifted, evaluated, my actions weighed for their potential ripple effects. And as quickly as it came, the presence receded, fading into the depths of the hidden chambers around me. I found myself alone in the dark, the mechanical hum slowly receding, replaced by an unsettling silence. By some miracle, or perhaps an alien override, my flashlight flickered back to life. I left the file where I found it, hastily exiting the bunker, and I fled the military base, my every step shadowed by an eerie sense of being watched. Days turned to weeks, and no one came looking for me. Life resumed its old rhythm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being a marked man, of knowing too much, yet understanding too little. Recently I've noticed them, people who don't quite fit in, whose gaze lingers a little bit too long, who vanish when I look again. They're always there, on the periphery of my life, never intervening but always observing. And each night as I try to sleep, the last thought that crosses my mind is that single haunting sentence: final phase initiation imminent. I still don't know what it means or when it will happen, but the unsettling realization lingers. I am now a small involuntary part of this looming final phase, whatever it is. And so I wait, wondering when the true cost of my curiosity will reveal itself. This happened when I was in middle school. I'm about to graduate high school. I still remember every detail to this day. When I was younger, my mother sent my siblings and I to this cute little summer camp in the mountains. It was 1 week in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no quick way to reach anybody, and we were miles and miles from the nearest town. This event happened in my 3rd year of attendance. The way these campsites were set up goes as follows. You were split up by gender and age group. Each campsite had 4 cabins with 5 raised beds in each and 1 lean-to for the assigned camp counselor. So in your cabin, you've got 4 buddies that you get to know fairly well throughout the week. There's also no bathrooms at the campsites. So if you had to go, you would have to get the TP from your counselor and go into the woods. We were about 12 at the time, so we always had to go with a buddy. This one night, a girl in my cabin, who I had become pretty close with throughout the week, was just talking to me in the dark of our cabin about absolutely nothing. Just 2 kids who couldn't sleep, so we opted to stay up and talk until we could sleep. Eventually, she tells me she has to go to the bathroom and asks if I'll go with her. I say, yeah, no biggie. So we grab our flashlights and sandals and hike over to get some TP, and then we go back past our cabin. Ours was the farthest out, on the edge of our campsite, a good 20 feet from the other cabins, and we go a little ways into the woods. I stand on the path while she goes up into the trees to do her business. Again, we're 12. It's cold, and we're both afraid of the dark. So she asks me to keep talking to her so she doesn't freak herself out. So we're talking about nothing, and I'm doing that little step dance you do when you're cold, swishing my flashlight around to see if I'd find anything cool. I almost never go to the mountains, and I just wanted to know if there'd be any cool plants or animals that I could see in the distance. I stop as my light lands about 13 feet away from me. I was dead in my tracks. To this day, I don't know what else to describe this thing as other than the description of the rake from that creepypasta story. I know how childish that sounds, but it's the only comparison I had in my head. It looked freakishly lanky, extremely decrepit, pale, hairless, like a person, but definitely not a person. I could only see its head, shoulders, and from its forearms to its fingers, it stretched out as if it was crawling down the path. It had long, spindly fingers that seemed to sharpen at the end. I really don't know if I was looking at nails and claws, or if its skin was just stretched like that. Its head was pointed slightly downward, and I would later figure that it was as if it was trying to avoid the light beam. But I could still see its eyes that still make me shiver if I think about it too long. Large, black ones. I don't know if it was extremely dilated pupils or if its eyes were just black, but it was like the eyes themselves bulged out of its head. I was too scared to shine my light any farther, and I could see one of its hands slowly creeping toward me. I was petrified in my spot. I didn't move my light off of it once I saw it. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to just leave this girl out there if it actually was something that might have hurt her. I told her to hurry up. She asked me why my voice was shaking. I remember saying, I don't want you to freak out. It's probably nothing. I'll tell you when we get back. But when you're done, just tell me, because we're going to make a run for the cabin, okay? That really made her move. I felt bad for scaring her, but I myself was terrified. I heard her say, "Done," and I just told her to run. I spun around, finally taking my light off of it, and sprinted so quickly that I caught up to her in seconds. This might have been my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears, but I was sure I could hear it almost galloping behind me. We were both moving so quickly that we slipped a bit on the leaves in front of our cabin door. I remember two of the other girls waking up when the door slammed behind us, as I fumbled with the hook that would lock it. I don't really know how I thought that would help, though. It was a poor lock. My friend was freaking out, asking me what I saw, and practically begging me to tell her I was pranking her. I couldn't say anything, though, as I had begun to have one of the worst panic attacks in my life. My breathing became audibly labored, and someone had to get up to get our camp counselor, which is what got me talking again. She got about halfway to the door before I said, "No," and that was what made everyone more freaked out. Eventually, our counselor heard us and came to the cabin. Someone opened the door for her and she came in, wanting to know why I was crying so viciously and why everyone was panicked. I was able to piece together a coherent enough sentence that she got the gist. Obviously, she didn't believe me, who would, but she finally gave up on trying to convince me when she offered to go with me to confirm there was nothing there, and I just kept crying harder at the thought. I slept in the lean-to with her for the rest of the week. I'll be the first to admit that I can't honestly know what I saw. I was 12, it was dark, and I was tired, with probably an overactive imagination. But I know that staring off into the dark has never struck such terror into me like that before. I know that figure that I saw. I just don't know what to call it. I still don't really know what to make of it, but I think about it every summer. About 20 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I worked as a window coverings installer in Sacramento, California. One day, I was sent with a large load of metal mini blinds to an active veterans hospital off Highway 50. I met the lead maintenance man, who thankfully loaned me a rolling cart to help make transporting my materials and tools a much easier chore. He then led me into the building, through a maze of corridors, and up a large service elevator. As we exited the elevator, I was pleasantly greeted with a completely empty hospital wing. I was happy to see that I had the entire floor to myself. No patients, staff, or furniture to constrain my mission. I could work quickly, without obstruction or distraction. The maintenance man explained how they just completed some seismic retrofits, while pointing to some newly constructed drywall columns that concealed the brunt of their work. He said they took that opportunity to make cosmetic repairs, install new blinds, and give the place a much-needed paint job. He then showed me a typical patient room and said there should be one blind for every window on the floor. He told me he would leave it to me and give him a call if I needed anything, or when I was ready to leave. Last thing he said, in a concerned, fatherly voice before entering the elevator was, "You sure you're going to be all right up in here?" I responded, "Absolutely," in my best, confident young man's voice. With a departing handshake, he entered the elevator cab. His question, and its tone, oddly hung with me as the doors and the whirl of the old elevator faded into a deafening silence. It was at that moment I was truly able to take in my surroundings. With the elevator to my back, I scanned the hospital wing in a clockwise direction. I was standing in the middle of a long rectangular room. Light and airy patient rooms filled the perimeter of the open room to my left. As I scanned right, The light quickly faded into an inky, opaque blackness that disappeared into a U-shaped corridor, which, after a short distance, made a sharp right and another sharp right to end up back where I started. Despite the new paint, the place looked like it exited a time machine circa 1950, with those pea-green ceramic walls and matching asbestos vinyl floor tiles. It was at that moment that I realized this place was really creepy. But enough of that, I had a job to do, and I got right to work. First things first, I walked the entire perimeter to get a quick survey of where things were located, popping my head into each room as I passed. As I got to the dark hallway, my bravery waned. Due to the lack of light, I presumed there must not have been any windows to address, but I pushed on nevertheless just to be thorough. As the darkness engulfed me, it felt like somebody plugged me into an electrical socket. I had never before or since felt the energy that surged through my body and immediately picked up my pace. Along both sides of the corridor were black rooms. After peeking in one, I abandoned my efforts for the absolute certainty that I was about to come face to face with something I did not want to see. I began to full-on run the rest of the distance until I was back in the main hall. Luckily, there was only one room within the dark corridor that had a blind I needed to install. The entire time I was back there, it felt like I had 1,000 spectators, and I kept my eyes fixated on the doorway until I was done. The rest of my time in that wing, I was nervously on edge. The farther from the dark corridor I got, the slightly more at ease I became. However, I kept hearing distinct footsteps, bangs, knocks, a bucket being kicked and slid across the floor, muffled voices, and a phantom intercom that sounded like an old movie. With 100% certainty, all of these noises originated around me on that wing, despite there being nobody present. With each noise, I would pop my head out into the main hall, or say, "Hello?" in what I'm sure was an uneasy voice. About halfway through the install, I finally stopped reacting, until I heard, "Hello?" and my name, and I froze. Thankfully, it was the maintenance man, and I was super excited to see him. He asked how everything was going, and if anything eventful had happened. Not wanting to sound kooky, I sheepishly brought up some of the noises I was hearing. He abruptly said, "Yeah, no kidding, this place is super haunted. I wouldn't work up here alone." He explained to me that the hospital had been an active war hospital dating back to the 1940s, and there had been thousands of deaths in the operating rooms that lined that dark corridor. He also mentioned that an electrician walked out on them earlier that week after something back there ran up behind him and growled. We joked around a bit to ease the tension, and then he left me alone once again. The rest of the day was surprisingly uneventful. Things seemed to have calmed down, and I felt calmer. I do remember never feeling more relieved to leave a place behind than that place, but also being completely exhausted that afternoon, and crashing out to sleep early that evening. To this day, it remains the strangest experience of my life.